The question I am asking in today's episode of Sandman Exclusive is, are the economic policies of US President Donald Trump actually working? How is the US economy really doing with conflicting data being published almost on a daily basis? And that's why I'm pretty excited to speak with someone who really knows what they're talking about. My interview partner today is Dr. Pippa Malmgren, who is an economist but also an award-winning and best-selling author. She's also a former US presidential advisor, and she still advises prime ministers, CEOs, presidents, tech incubators, and business leaders. And with that, let's go straight to the interview. All right, Pippa, thank you so much for taking the time. If okay with you, let's begin with a question that is not related to the economy. What is your analysis on the dynamic that is currently unfolding after the assassination of Charlie Kirk? How dangerous would you say is the current situation in the United States at the moment?
So it is a very charged environment. And of course, there's an outpouring of grief for Charlie Kirk and also for another victim of crime, which was the Ukrainian refugee Irina Zarutska, who was very randomly killed on public transportation. And I mentioned both of these because in the US, there's a real division between the people who see one of them as a serious event, but not the other. And the country's kind of divided between these two. But fundamentally, they are very political questions at hand. Are these driven by political motivations? Or is the lack of coverage of them driven by political motivations? Or is the overwhelming coverage driven by it? So, what it really reveals is a much deeper wound that exists in the United States today. And that is a function of an enormous fight between not the left and the right, I think, actually, but between the old establishment and the new Trump administration, which has a very anti-establishment stance, which is against both Republicans and Democrats in many ways. I know that's a complex answer, but we can expect to see this linger for a long time. It's symptomatic of a much more profound divide within the United States.
Let's switch the topic and talk a little bit about the US economy. A really interesting subject also from my point of view, sitting in Berlin, sitting in Europe. Obviously, we follow the US economy closely. We try to sort of see the signs. How is the US economy doing at the moment? Obviously, that has huge implications also for Europe and Germany as well. So how would you describe the current situation? Are there cracks in the US economy, or is it actually stronger than expected? Are some people trying to see cracks in the US economy because they want them to be there and they're actually not? What would you say from your perspective is the situation with regards to the state of the US economy at the moment?
So, of course, Germany is very famous for its automotive engineering. So, I'm going to use a car metaphor. If you were rehauling the engine of a very, very valuable, say, Mercedes, if you ask the question, how is the car performing? Your answer might be, well, not very well, because it's undergoing a massive rehaul. That is where we are in the United States. So, considering the massive rehaul that the administration is attempting to do, completely restructuring the cash flows of the nation through a combination of not just leaning on tariffs, which the United States has not used as a source of real revenue since 1914, but prior to 1914 was our principal source of revenue in the United States. But in addition, is introducing completely novel concepts like stablecoins, Bitcoin reserve, which are a way of profoundly changing the way the economy functions, I think for the better, but it's novel. So there's an adjustment process. And then there's adjustment with regard to regulation, taxes, et cetera. So given the magnitude of the overhaul, I think the economy is doing incredibly well. If you don't take into account the radical nature of this transformation of how the economy functions, then you might say, oh, there are cracks. But honestly, compared to the rest of the world, the US is still extremely strong. It's still an unbelievably entrepreneurial nation. And one interesting thing is that the capital for new ventures is no longer really being controlled only by Silicon Valley. The capital is now flowing to places like where I live, Austin, Texas, Nashville, Tennessee, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and it's not only going into software anymore, it's now going into hardware and what I would call shardware, which is where software and hardware combine, but also into the biological sciences, which you might call wetware. Like suddenly the capital's flowing more freely across the country and all the different sectors than before. It's also going to smaller firms, more entrepreneurial ventures than just the mega corporations. So that's also an adjustment that's occurring. But we generate two-thirds of our net new jobs from firms that employ less than 50 people. And most of the innovation now comes from these smaller firms. So if we look at it that way, I think the US is looking pretty good. And I talk to investors all over the world continuously, and they are very focused on how to be part of the growth story in the United States. They seem to be drawn in by this combination of events.
It's a really interesting point that you raised, that the U.S. is sort of, and I like your car analogy that resonates with a German. So I mean, looking at what you just said, and also maybe putting it into context with the most recent job numbers that came. So there are two sort of important job market numbers that came. The more recent ones looking at specifically the past months, but then also the revision for 2024, obviously a time when Donald Trump was not yet president. This was still the Biden era. But maybe combining those two and sort of looking at the job market in general, how do you interpret those numbers, and would you say they're also, you have to see them in the context of the United States being in this sort of transition period? That's why they might not look as good as people would expect them to be.
Yes, well, and of course, there's a very big argument going on about whether the jobs numbers under the last year of the Biden administration were accurate or they're needing to be heavily revised. And right now, we've just got some revision numbers that imply the economy was not doing as well as people thought during the election period. And of course, it's very common for whoever is in the White House to try to produce the best possible numbers when they're in an election moment. And almost inevitably, they do get revised after a new president arrives. So this isn't new. It's an ongoing phenomena in American politics. The second thing that I think is really important is technological innovation is changing the way the economy works on the jobs front. So more and more, particularly young people, are no longer going for one job with one employer with one job title. Instead, they are working in a portfolio, creating a series of different cash flows. So they may be a consultant to a big organization, a traditional firm, but they're also trying to launch a startup. They're working with a friend on a startup. They've figured out how to make money off of Instagram or some app on their phone, passive income. They're leaning heavily into the tokenization of assets. And so when we say the jobs numbers are down, does that mean that work is down or
Mm-hmm.
income is down?
Mm-hmm.
And we're used to assuming that if jobs are down, income must be down. But I think something profound is happening where people are not working in a traditional job, but their income is going up.
Very interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
And
So
we don't
yeah.
account
Yeah.
for that yet well.
Okay. So the numbers can't yet account for that sort of dynamic that is happening. Okay.
I think it's, by the way, even more profound. It's a kind of a shift from um, a career that's sequential,
Mm-hmm.
where you do one job with one job title at a time, and then you move to another job after that. This is not how people are working. They're working simultaneously in a portfolio.
Hmm.
They're creating a portfolio
Yep.
of different cash flows and revenue streams
Yeah.
that all operate at once.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's talk about US President Donald Trump a little bit and his economic policies. Obviously, also a huge topic, as you can imagine, in countries like Germany, when we're talking about tariffs, for example, the major deal that was struck between the European Union and the United States not too long ago. People say here, to the disadvantage of the EU and possibly to the advantage of the United States, but that is to be seen. But in general, maybe the just simple, direct question with regards to Donald Trump's economic policies, are they actually working?
So I think it's too early to judge whether this is working because it's so radical. It's so completely different from anything we've seen before. So time has to pass before we can really tell. But I would think about this. This may be a challenging notion, but if we look back in history, most empires have some kind of a tribute system. And if we look at the largest empire in history, the Mongolian Empire, how did it work? They basically came in fast and gave the new conquered area two choices: use our coins, use our money, pay us taxes in our own money. You can keep your culture, keep doing anything else you want, but that's the deal. And if you don't like that deal, then there's going to be trouble. And so almost everybody said, well, I'd rather survive. Let's use their money and pay the tribute. Medieval Europe was full of empires extracting tribute from anyone passing through or anyone living in that economy. So today, how is America imposing its tribute system? Well, in the past, it did it strictly through treasuries. And if you're an ally of the United States, or if you were just a smart investor, you would buy US treasuries because they were the risk-free asset. Today, in a world where the globe has 3 times as much debt as GDP, and virtually every nation has more debt than they can pay back, and that includes the United States, the president and Scott Bessent in particular, the Secretary of the Treasury, are coming up with innovative new ways to generate inflow into the US bond market. So one of those is the introduction of stablecoins and a
Hmm.
Bitcoin reserve, which are convertible to US dollars and collateralized by US treasuries.
Hmm.
And they, I think, are not well understood in Europe. And I think there's a need to just explain this very quickly, which is this is about widening the pathway for any company to raise capital. So you no longer have to rely on Wall Street and an IPO. You are going to be able to raise capital by going to almost directly to retail investors. So Citigroup will issue stable coins, and so will some local grocery store chain.
Hmm.
So suddenly the US can fund the entrepreneurial spirit much more easily than before. Now, that is going to pull money out of Europe as
Hmm.
investors look for higher performance.
Hmm.
And that's one reason the European Central Bank opposed the introduction of stable coins and their convertibility to US dollars. Because, put really simply, this is a strategy for dollarizing the entire world economy.
Right.
And most investors, when they've made a lot of money, if we think of everyone in Asia, for example, where they all have some form of capital controls, they would all rather have their money in dollars.
Yeah.
So, this new strategy, and I think some Europeans have the same view, this new strategy makes it much easier and more attractive for investors to get their capital into the United States at a time when the US is fundamentally becoming an entrepreneur's economy rather than a corporate economy. And therefore, Europe now has to really think about what happens to them if the capital gets sucked into the US
Yeah.
and it becomes even harder to finance the debt picture of Europe at a time when there's discussion in the market that the United Kingdom and France are potentially having to go have a conversation with the IMF.
Yeah.
And of course, the president's position is that he is not going to back an IMF bailout for any of the major European nations, principally because he feels they have not been cooperative on trying to reach a deal over ending the war in Ukraine. So, from a White House view, they're like, you guys have a debt problem, but you want to keep doing the war. You can't do both.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
we're not going to support, we, the United States, are not going to support you not addressing your debt problem and adding to it by continuing in a fight that the US no longer has total support for.
Very interesting. Yeah. Last question. Let's have a look also at India, Russia, and China. I'm sure you recently saw the pictures when those nations came together. The leaders of those nations came together. Strong pictures that also resonated a lot here in Germany, and I'm sure they also did in the United States. Would you argue that there is sort of this other new alliance that is also forming, maybe even due to the fact that the US has pushed, for example, India a little bit away from the West? That's the one part of the question. And then the second part, and you already touched on it actually, is what remains for Europe? I mean, do you as an American see Europe as this sort of old-fashioned area of the world that hasn't quite understood yet that it really has to act in many ways, in terms of military on the one hand, but also in terms of innovation, in terms of sort of new ideas for the future when it comes to the financial markets, but also the startup market. So maybe those two questions: how do you see that new alliance forming on the one hand, these emerging countries, which are not really emerging anymore, they're already big players, and then on the other hand you have the old Europe, and the question whether they can innovate also in competition with the United States.
So it's a very complex situation, but I would put it like this. Um, uh, India and China and Russia have long been part of something called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is kind of the counterpart to NATO. So having them get together and hold hands is not new. People are sensitive right now because the president's policies, particularly on tariffs, have been so aggressive. But I would give a counter view that actually what's happening is the president is negotiating with particularly Russia and China over finding ways to bring the various conflicts to a close. And that's not just Ukraine or also Gaza, but it also includes a broader landscape of conflict, which I've called the hot war in cold places, where the superpowers have been facing off in the cold places like space, the Arctic, the high north, the Baltic. These have all been conflict zones, even though the press hasn't covered them as actively. But from a strategic security point of view, everyone's been well aware that these locations, I'll add naval locations above and below the high seas, subsea cable cuts, for example, conflict, which we see a lot of. The president's trying to resolve all of that, to reach a kind of grand bargain in the same way that Otto von Bismarck was famous for reaching grand bargains. And there's a saying that Otto von Bismarck had as chancellor, which was, diplomacy is the art of building ladders for others to climb down. And in a sense, that is very much part of the president's strategy. I think he views these conflict situations as partly created by the previous administration. He doesn't accept the view that this was all blameless, that it was just out of the blue. He thinks that many of the organizations that the previous administration supported and sponsored, non-governmental organizations, played an active role in stoking these conflicts, not only in Ukraine, but in all these places. So, in the dialogue with Russia and China, he's offering possibilities. And I think they are accepting some of these possibilities. These include, for example, that China is starting to heavily develop the east of Russia, Siberia, part of Russia that's never had any capital investment before. From a Russian point of view, this is welcome, right? They want to see their east develop because there's so many resources. From China's point of view, this is a new way to grow because what does the east of the Urals, offer China? It offers water, protein, raw materials, energy, and access to the Arctic, which is the critical pathway now for getting goods from China to Europe and vice versa, from Dalian to Rotterdam, which is why China's invested so heavily in Rotterdam. So, bottom line is they are discussing how to become friends with the United States again, but they view the US as divided. There's the administration that has this particular view about let's find a way to all hold hands again, versus what President Trump would call the deep state, and that their view is under no circumstances can we cut a deal with the Russians and the Chinese, and we must stay at war, and they will do whatever's necessary to make sure that all this conflict continues. And so the view is America's kind of in a civil conflict. And the president and the White House view it that way too. The Charlie Kirk murder will be perceived as a potential example of that. We'll see. They may say, well, it was just a lone gunman. But I think even if they say that, they believe that they are in a civil conflict in the United States over these fundamental questions. So I don't think it's a done deal that suddenly it's the US versus Russia, China, and India. It's rather more complex as all of these parties are trying to figure out how do we get to the future without having to have bloodshed? How do we pass through this period of conflict without having it morph into World War III? And bottom line, I don't think any of them want that to happen. China's economy is in terrible shape. They have terrible youth unemployment. The demographics are appalling. And I do think the Communist Party in China is asking itself, do we really want to go to war with the United States? Can we actually win that? And by the way, the president is much more flexible on the question of Taiwan than any previous president, partly because the chip production that was so central to their strategic value has moved to Texas and Arizona. And TSMC, the biggest company making chips in the world, but the Taiwanese company, have already said that they are now fundamentally shifting to become a much more American-oriented company. So could there be some kind of arrangement, a 50-year deal, a 100-year deal on Taiwan, with the proviso that China needs to become more like Taiwan, not Taiwan needs to be more like China? So I'll finish by saying this. The Chinese Communist Party is asking itself, do we really want to go to war with the Americans, or do we want to go back to making money again? Actually, I think they want to go back to making money again. And that means being open to novel and creative ways to resolve the various stress points and working with China and India to do that. So I don't think we can draw from those photographs that this is all anti-US. What it is representing a very complex moment in a negotiation process.
And maybe just two sentences. I know we're running out of time, but Europe. What's your recommendation for Europe? I mean, what would you say that this continent, the European Union, also now needs to do in order to not fall back, basically?
So right now, America is in a very introspective way of being. Now, it has been for some decades, actually, but it's even more so than usual. So the US is not that focused on Europe right now. That's also because there is a perception that Europeans are not doing very much to deal with their debt problem, because it's a painful process, and because the Europeans are arguing in favor of continuing conflict, which, from an American point of view, that there's not as much support for that right now. Um, but what people are also noticing is this same conflict that I've described in the United States also exists in Europe. And we're seeing sort of two different camps forming about how to handle some of these core issues like debt. Immigration is another one. So people are watching to see which way is Europe going to go. The polls are telling us that the voting public are leaning a little bit more in the direction of Donald Trump these days. Interestingly, the policymakers are leaning in the other direction, closer to where the Biden administration was on policy. And so we don't know, how is Europe going to resolve these very fundamental questions. And as we see which way Europe is going to go, it'll become easier to say, what does that mean for the relationship with the United States?
Very interesting. Dr. Pippa Malmgren, thank you so much for taking the time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.